Luis Garcia had been cooking at the Harmony Heights multi-species orphanage for 2 years, and he'd learned that every species in the galaxy had comfort food. The young Rigelians craved something that tasted like the sea foam of their home world. The Andromedan kids needed crystalline structures that dissolved slowly on their tongues, and the Zephyrian children required foods that changed color as they ate them. But Arya was different. In 18 months at the orphanage, the 16-year-old Victorian had never once asked for seconds, never requested a favorite dish, never even finished a complete meal. She picked at her food with the same suspicious hostility she directed at everyone else, staff, other kids, and especially the well-meaning social workers who kept trying to find her a forever family. "She's back," whispered Tommy, one of the younger human kids, as Arya stalked into the dining hall for breakfast. Her dark purple skin had taken on the mottled black patterns that indicated extreme agitation in Victorian adolescence, and her retractable claws were partially extended, never a good sign. Luis looked up from the industrial-sized griddle, where he was preparing breakfast for 43 kids from 12 different species. Arya slumped into her usual corner table, as far from the other children as possible, her angular features set in the expression of someone who expected the worst from every interaction. "Morning, Arya," Luis called out cheerfully, the same way he greeted every kid every day. "Got your usual ready the nutrient paste with extra protein for Victorian dietary requirements." Arya's response was her typical grunt of acknowledgement, but Luis noticed something different today. The angry purple flush in her skin seemed deeper than usual, and there were fresh scratches on her arms that looked self-inflicted. In his 2 years of working with traumatized kids, Luis had learned to recognize the signs when someone was moving from general unhappiness to genuine crisis. As Luis served breakfast to the chattering crowd of multi-species children, he kept one eye on Arya's table. She was staring at her food without eating, her claws unconsciously scratching patterns into the metal surface of the table. Whatever had happened last night or this morning, it had pushed her past her normal level of hostile withdrawal into something more concerning. "Luis," said Dr. Prism Chun, the orphanage's human administrator, approaching the serving counter with the harried expression she wore during crisis management mode. "We need to talk about Arya after breakfast. There was an incident at the Integration Academy yesterday." Luis continued serving while listening. The Integration Academy was where older orphans attended classes with children from established families, learning to function in the multi-species society they'd eventually need to navigate as adults. What kind of incident? Bullying. A group of young Crotarians apparently cornered her during lunch break, making comments about her species' reputation for violence and aggression. They suggested that Victorians were inherently dangerous and shouldn't be allowed around civilized species children. Luis's grip tightened on the serving spoon. He'd heard these kinds of prejudices before. Victorians had a reputation as a warrior culture, and many species viewed them as naturally violent, despite the fact that most Victorian children were gentle and thoughtful when treated with respect. How did Arya respond? Dr. Chun's expression grew more troubled. She proved their point, unfortunately, lost her temper completely, extended her claws, and left 3 Crotarian kids with scratches that required medical attention. The Academy is considering whether to suspend her, and the Crotarian families are demanding she be transferred to a different facility. Luis looked over at Arya, who was now methodically shredding her nutrient paste into tiny pieces without eating any of it. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone expecting an attack from any direction. "Dr. Chun, has anyone actually asked Arya what she wants? What she needs?" "Luis, I appreciate your concern, but Arya has been in the system for 3 years. She's been through 6 different foster placements, 2 group homes, and countless therapy sessions. At some point, we have to acknowledge that some kids are just too damaged to integrate successfully." Luis had heard this kind of resigned professional assessment before, usually right before a kid got transferred to a more restrictive facility or aged out of the system without the skills they needed to succeed independently. What if she's not too damaged? What if she's just hungry? Dr. Chun looked puzzled. "Luis, Arya receives all the nutritionally appropriate food for her species. Her dietary needs are being met according to galactic standards for Victorian adolescent development. That's not what I mean. Luis finished serving the last of the children and began cleaning his preparation area. But his mind was working on a problem that went far beyond nutrition. In 2 years of cooking for traumatized kids, he'd learned that sometimes the most important thing he could provide wasn't food for their bodies, but evidence that someone cared enough to pay attention to their individual needs. Dr. Chun, give me a week. A week to do what? To see if Arya's behavioral problems might be related to something simpler than deep psychological trauma. Dr. Chun studied Luis with the expression administrators wore when maintenance staff started offering opinions about complex therapeutic issues. Luis, I appreciate your dedication to the children, but Arya's problems require professional intervention. Not just what? Just caring? Just attention? Just someone treating her like a person instead of a case file? The dining hall had mostly emptied while they talked, but Arya remained at her corner table, still shredding her food into smaller and smaller pieces. Luis made a decision that would either help an angry kid or get him in serious trouble with his supervisor. Arya, he called out, walking over to her table. Can I ask you something? The Victorian teenager looked up with the wary expression of someone who expected any adult attention to lead to lectures, punishment, or unwanted advice. What? What's your favorite food? Not what's supposed to be good for you. Not what's nutritionally appropriate for your species. What's the food that makes you feel better when everything else sucks? Arya stared at Lise as if he'd asked her to explain quantum physics in ancient Vulcan. The question seemed to genuinely confuse her. I don't have favorite foods. Sure you do. Everyone has favorite foods. Maybe it's something from when you were little, before you came to the orphanage. Or maybe it's something you've smelled cooking that made you curious. Arya's claws retracted slightly, and Luis could see her thinking. For a moment, the hostile mask slipped, and he caught a glimpse of the lonely kid underneath all the anger. There's this thing. When I was really small, my birth mother used to make something. I don't know what humans would call it. It was sweet, but also had this spicy bite that made your tongue tingle, and it was warm, like eating sunshine. Lise felt something click into place. This wasn't a damaged kid who couldn't integrate with society. This was a homesick teenager who had never been offered the simple comfort of familiar flavors from her lost childhood. Arya, would you be willing to help me figure out how to make something like that? Not for therapy or integration training or any of that official stuff. Just because everyone deserves to eat food that makes them feel at home. For the first time in 18 months, Arya's aggressive posture softened. The mottled black patterns in her purple skin began to fade, replaced by the subtle silver that indicated curiosity in young Victorians. You ... Wold want to learn Victorian cooking? I'd want to learn what makes you feel less alone. Dr. Chun was watching this interaction with growing concern, but Luis ignored her. He was watching Arya's face, seeing something he'd never observed in all her months at the orphanage. Hope. Most humans think Victorian food is too aggressive for their palates, Arya said carefully. Most humans haven't met a Victorian willing to teach them. Besides, I've been cooking for 2 years without learning anything about the most interesting person in this place. Arya actually smiled just for a moment, but Luis caught it. Under all that anger and defensive hostility was a kid who wanted to be known, to be valued for something other than her behavioral problems. Okay, she said quietly. But I don't remember all the ingredients. It's been a long time. That's fine. We'll figure it out together. As Lise began planning an unconventional cooking lesson with the orphanage's most difficult resident, he had no idea that this simple offer would lead to discoveries that challenged everything the galactic community believed about Victorian culture. Adolescent rehabilitation and the power of treating someone like they mattered. All he knew was that Arya deserved to eat food that tasted like home, and he was going to figure out how to make that happen, even if it meant learning to cook with ingredients that could probably dissolve metal. The next morning, Luis arrived at the orphanage kitchen 2 hours early to research Victorian cuisine using the Galactic Food Database. What he discovered made him understand why Arya had been surviving on bland nutrient paste for 18 months. According to official dietary guidelines, traditional Victorian food was classified as potentially hazardous to non-Victorian species due to high concentrations of capsaicin-like compounds. fermented proteins that could cause digestive distress in most other species, and spice combinations that were considered aggressively intense by galactic culinary standards. More troubling, the database suggested that Vectarian dietary preferences were linked to their species' naturally aggressive temperament, and that adopting families should gradually transition Vectarian children to more civilized food choices to promote behavioral integration. Luis stared at the screen, feeling a familiar surge of anger at the casual racism embedded in supposedly objective scientific documentation. The guidelines basically suggested that Arya's cultural food preferences were evidence of primitive behavior that needed to be corrected. No wonder she'd been eating nutrient paste. The orphanage's well-meaning nutritionist had been following official protocols designed to civilize her palate while ignoring the possibility that familiar flavors might actually help her feel secure and connected to her heritage. "You're here early," Dr. Chon observed, finding Luis reading research articles about Vectarian culture at the kitchen's data terminal. "Learning about our kids," Luis replied, not looking up from an article about traditional Vectarian family meal practices. "Did you know that in Vectarian culture, preparing food for someone is considered one of the highest expressions of respect and affection?" "Luis, I appreciate your interest in multicultural understanding, but we need to discuss Arya's situation practically. The Integration Academy has scheduled a disciplinary hearing for tomorrow, and the Kratarian families are threatening to withdraw their children if she remains enrolled." Luis finally turned from the computer to face his supervisor. "Dr. Chun, what if the problem isn't Arya's behavior? What if the problem is that we've been treating her like a dangerous animal that needs to be tamed, instead of a homesick kid who needs to feel valued?" "That's a very idealistic perspective, Luis. But the reality is that Arya has a documented history of aggressive incidents across multiple placements. Yesterday's violence was just the latest in a pattern of behavioral problems that suggest she may not be suitable for mainstream integration." Luis had heard this kind of institutional language before, the careful, clinical terminology that administrators used when they'd given up on a kid and were preparing to transfer them to a more restrictive environment. What happens to kids who get classified as unsuitable for mainstream integration? Dr. Chun's expression grew uncomfortable. "There are specialized facilities designed for adolescents with severe behavioral challenges. They focus on containment and basic life skills rather than family placement or educational integration." "You mean juvenile detention centers for alien kids who don't fit the approved behavioral profile?" "Luis, I understand your emotional investment in helping Arya, but some children come to us with trauma and cultural backgrounds that make successful integration extremely difficult. We have to consider the safety and well-being of all our residents." Luis looked through the kitchen service window at the dining hall, where early rising kids from multiple species were beginning to gather for breakfast. Human children chatted with young Andromedans. Rigelian teenagers helped smaller Zephyrian kids reach the juice dispensers. And a mixed group of species was engaged in what appeared to be a collaborative art project. The integration model worked beautifully for most of the orphans, but it failed completely for kids like Arya, who had been labeled as fundamentally incompatible with civilized society. "Dr. Chun, what if we're wrong about what integration means? What if, instead of trying to make Arya act more like the other species, we helped the other kids understand and appreciate what makes Vectarian culture valuable?" "Luis, cultural appreciation programs are wonderful in theory, but they don't address Arya's tendency toward violent responses to conflict." That's when Luis realized the real problem. Everyone from social workers to Integration Academy teachers to the other children had accepted the premise that Vectarian cultural traits were inherently problematic. Arya's anger wasn't just about being bullied. It was about living in a world that viewed her entire species as primitively violent. "Dr. Chun, I want to try something. Give me 1 week to work with Arya in the kitchen. Not therapy, not behavioral modification, just cooking. If her behavior doesn't improve, I'll support whatever placement decision you think is best." Dr. Chun studied Luis with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to humor a well-meaning but naive employee or shut down an idea that could potentially create more problems. 1 week. But if there are any incidents, any signs of aggression or violence, the experiment ends immediately. An hour later, Lise found himself in the unprecedented situation of conducting a cooking lesson with the orphanage's most difficult resident, while 20 curious kids from multiple species watched from the dining hall. The first thing about vegetarian cooking, Arya explained, her voice still cautious, but gaining confidence as she handled familiar ingredients, is that heat isn't just about temperature, it's about layers of sensation that build complexity. Luis watched Arya transform as she began working with the specialty ingredients he'd requisitioned from the Galactic Food Supply Network. Her aggressive posture softened, her claws retracted completely, and the angry black patterns in her skin gave way to subtle purples and silvers that indicated concentration and enthusiasm. See, humans think spicy just means painful, Arya continued, grinding something that looked like crystalline pepper with movements that were surprisingly graceful and precise. But vegetarian heat is about harmony. The burn has to balance with sweet, sour, bitter, and umami in specific ratios, or the whole dish fails. Like cooking chemistry, Luce observed, genuinely fascinated by the complexity of what Arya was demonstrating. Exactly. My birth mother always said that cooking was the practical application of understanding how different elements interact to create something better than the sum of their parts. Luis noted the way Arya's entire demeanor changed when she talked about her early memories. The defensive hostility disappeared, replaced by pride and knowledge that no one had ever asked her to share. But their cooking lesson was interrupted by shouting from the dining hall. "She's probably planning to poison us," came a young voice that Luis recognized as belonging to Crix, one of the older Kratarian kids. Everyone knows Victorians use food as a weapon. Luis looked through the service window to see Crix leading a group of children in mocking gestures directed at Arya's cooking demonstration. The Kratarian boy was performing an exaggerated pantomime of someone being burned by spicy food, complete with dramatic writhing and fake screaming. "See?" Crix announced to his audience. "This is why Victorians can't live with civilized species. They can't even cook without trying to hurt people." Luis felt Arya tense beside him. The purple skin began showing the mottled black patterns that indicated rising aggression, and her claws started to extend. "Arya," Luis said quietly, "look at me, not at them." But the damage was already done. 18 months of accumulated frustration, combined with the public humiliation of having her cultural heritage mocked while she was trying to share something meaningful, had pushed Arya past her breaking point. "You want to see Victorian violence?" she snarled, her claws now fully extended as she stepped toward the dining hall. "I'll show you exactly why your parents are right to be afraid of us." Luis moved quickly to position himself between Arya and the dining hall full of children, but he realized that physical intervention would only confirm everyone's assumptions about Victorian aggression and the need to control it through force. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He picked up the wooden spoon Arya had been using to stir her traditional dish, and took a large bite of the partially completed recipe. The flavor hit him like a complex symphony played at maximum volume. There was heat, yes, but also sweetness, tangy fermentation, and a depth of flavor that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It was intense enough to bring tears to his eyes, but it was also undeniably delicious. "Holy shit," Luis said, loud enough for the entire dining hall to hear. "Arya, this is incredible." The room fell silent. Crix stopped his mocking performance. The other children turned to stare, and Arya's claws retracted in surprise. Double quotes? "You ... You actually like it?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "I like it? Arya, this is the most interesting thing I've ever tasted. It's like eating music." Luis took another bite, this time savoring the complexity of flavors that revealed themselves in layers as the heat built and subsided. "Crix, you want to know what's actually scary about Victorian culture?" Luis called out to the Kratarian boy. "It's that they understand flavor combinations so sophisticated that most other species can't even appreciate them. That's not primitive, that's advanced." But as Luis stood in the kitchen, defending Victorian culinary sophistication to a dining hall full of prejudiced children, he realized that their real problem was much bigger than cultural food preferences. The integration Academy hearing tomorrow wasn't just about Arya's behavioral issues. It was about whether the galactic community was willing to expand its definition of acceptable cultural expression to include species that didn't fit the approved model of civilized behavior. And if they failed, Arya would be transferred to a detention facility where her cultural heritage would be seen as evidence of inherent danger rather than a valuable perspective that could enrich the entire community. Lise looked at Arya, who was watching him with an expression of cautious hope mixed with disbelief that someone had actually defended her culture in public. "We're going to that hearing tomorrow," he told her, "and we're bringing lunch." That evening, Lise stayed late in the kitchen with Arya, ostensibly to perfect the traditional Victorian dish she'd been teaching him, but actually to give her the first opportunity she'd had in 3 years to talk about her memories, without being analyzed by social workers or therapists. "The thing people don't understand about Victorians," Arya said as she demonstrated the precise timing required for layering spices, "is that we're not actually aggressive by nature. We're protective." Louise stirred the aromatic mixture according to her instructions, noting how her entire demeanor had changed during their hours of cooking together. The hostile defensiveness had been replaced by focused concentration and something that looked almost like happiness. "What's the difference? Aggressive species attack first, ask questions later. Protective species defend what they love, but only when there's an actual threat." Arya tasted the dish and nodded approval at Luce's technique. "The problem is, when you're constantly being treated like you're dangerous, everything starts feeling like a threat." Louise understood. Arya's behavioral problems weren't evidence of inherent violence. They were the result of 3 years in a system that viewed her cultural traits as pathological. "Tell me about your birth mother," Louise said, settling into the kitchen's prep area for what felt like the first real conversation he'd ever had with Arya. The young Victorian's expression softened in a way Lise had never seen before. She was a stellar engineer on one of the deep space construction projects. Really smart, really gentle. Nothing like what people expect Victorians to be. What happened to her? Accident during the Rigel Station expansion project. She was part of a team installing navigation systems when there was a structural failure. Arya's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss traumatic events without breaking down. "I was 8, old enough to remember her, but too young to take care of myself." Louise waited, understanding that Arya was sharing something she'd probably never told the social workers and therapists who had processed her through the system. "The worst part wasn't losing her. The worst part was how people treated me afterward. Like being an orphan was evidence that Victorians were naturally unstable, that I was probably going to turn out violent and unmanageable because that's just how our species is." "Is that when the behavioral problems started?" Arya stirred the cooking food with movements that had become meditative and precise. "The behavioral problems started when I realized that no matter how polite I was, no matter how carefully I followed the rules, people were going to see me as a threat. So I figured, if they're going to be afraid of me anyway, I might as well give them something to be afraid of." Louise felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Arya's aggression wasn't pathological. It was strategic. She'd learned to weaponize other people's prejudices as a form of protection against rejection and abandonment. "But that strategy isn't working anymore, is it?" "No," Arya admitted. "It just makes me more lonely and angrier, and more likely to prove their point about Victorians being dangerous." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of cooking creating space for thoughts and feelings that were too complex for direct conversation. "Louise," Arya said eventually, "why are you helping me? I mean, really." Not the official answer about helping all the kids. Why me specifically? Louise had been asking himself the same question since their first cooking lesson. Why had he been willing to risk his job and reputation to defend a kid that everyone else had written off as incorrigibly troubled? "I guess because I see something in you that reminds me of myself when I was your age." "You were an aggressive alien teenager with claws?" Louise laughed. "I was an angry Mexican kid in a school system that treated my language, my food, and my family, traditions like they were obstacles to overcome rather than valuable parts of who I was." Arya looked at him with new attention. "Really? Really? Teachers who insisted I speak only English, even during lunch and recess. Classmates who made faces when my mom packed traditional Mexican food in my lunch. Guidance counselors who suggested I focus on practical career paths instead of the culinary arts because cooking wasn't considered a real profession for Hispanic students. What did you do? Same thing you did. Got angry, got defensive, proved their point about kids from my background being problematic. Spent most of high school in detention or suspension because I couldn't figure out how to be proud of my heritage without being hostile to everyone who didn't understand it. Arya was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. But you ended up okay. You have a job. You help kids. You're not angry all the time. I ended up okay because eventually I found people who appreciated my cooking instead of seeing it as evidence that I didn't belong. And because I learned that the best way to change people's minds about your culture isn't to get angry at their ignorance. It's to show them something beautiful they've never experienced before. Is that what we're doing with this dish? Trying to change people's minds about vegetarian culture? Luis checked the cooking timer and began preparing to plate their creation. We're doing something better than that. We're giving you a chance to share something you're proud of instead of just defending yourself against things you're ashamed of. As they put finishing touches on the traditional vegetarian meal, Luis realized that their cooking lessons had accomplished something that 18 months of therapy and behavioral intervention had failed to achieve. Arya was talking openly about her feelings, her memories, and her hopes without the defensive hostility that usually characterized her interactions with adults. Luis, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think I'm broken? Like fundamentally damaged in a way that means I can't live with normal families or go to regular school? The question broke Luis's heart, not just because of the pain it revealed, but because he recognized it as the central fear that drove all of Arya's defensive behavior. Arya, I think you're a smart, talented, interesting kid who has been surviving in a system that wasn't designed to value what makes you special. That's not broken, that's resilient. But the behavioral problems are a rational response to being treated like you're dangerous when you're actually just different. The problem isn't your behavior, Arya. The problem is a system that sees cultural differences as pathology. They finished plating the meal just as the kitchen timer indicated optimal serving temperature. The dish looked stunning, complex layers of color and texture that seemed to shift in the light, aromatic steam. That carried hints of sweetness, spice, and fermentation that was completely unlike anything Luis had ever encountered. Arya, this is beautiful. Your birth mother would be proud of what you've accomplished. For the first time in 18 months, Arya smiled without reservation. Not the careful, guarded expression she wore around adults, but a genuine smile of accomplishment and pride. You know what's funny? This is the first time I've made this dish since she died. I was afraid I wouldn't remember it right, that I'd mess up something that was important to her. And it tastes exactly like coming home. As they cleaned up the kitchen, Luis found himself thinking about the Integration Academy hearing scheduled for tomorrow. Arya's future would be determined by a panel of administrators who had never seen her as anything other than a behavioral problem to be managed or transferred. Arya, I want to ask you something, and you can say no if it makes you uncomfortable. Okay, tomorrow, at the hearing, instead of trying to defend your past behavior or promise to be different, what if we just showed them who you actually are? Not the angry, defensive version of you that everyone expects, but the thoughtful, skilled, culturally proud person I've been getting to know in this kitchen. Arya's expression grew wary. How? We bring lunch. We serve this meal to the administrators, the academy teachers, and the Kratarian families. We let them taste what vegetarian culture actually offers, instead of just hearing about why it's supposedly problematic. Lise, they're not going to change their minds about an entire species because of one meal. Maybe not, but they might change their minds about one kid who deserves a chance to share her gifts instead of being punished for her differences. Arya was quiet for a long time, weighing the risks and possibilities of Luis's proposal. What if they hate it? What if they think it's too aggressive, too intense, too foreign? What if it just proves their point about vegetarians being incompatible with civilized society? Luis looked at this remarkable teenager who had survived 3 years of systemic rejection and still maintained enough hope to share her cultural heritage with someone who cared enough to learn. Then we'll know We tried to build bridges instead of just defending walls. And maybe that's enough to change how you think about yourself, even if it doesn't change how they think about you. Arya considered this, her expression cycling through the complex emotions that Louise had learned to recognize as signs of internal processing in young Victorians. Okay, she said finally, let's do it. But Louise? Yeah? If this goes badly, if they use this as more evidence that I'm too different to integrate, I want you to know that these cooking lessons have been the best part of my time here. For the first time in 3 years, someone has treated me like I have something valuable to offer instead of something dangerous to control. Louise felt the weight of responsibility and possibility settling on his shoulders. Tomorrow, they would either demonstrate that cultural differences could be bridges instead of barriers, or they would provide ammunition for people who believed that some kids were too damaged by their heritage to succeed in mainstream society. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the orphanage, Arya was going to sleep knowing that someone valued her culture, appreciated her knowledge, and believed she deserved a future that honored rather than rejected her. Victorian identity, that sometimes that kind of hope was enough to change everything. The morning of the Integration Academy hearing, Louise arrived at the orphanage to find Arya sitting in the kitchen at 5 a.m., staring at the ingredients they prepared for their cultural demonstration. Her skin showed the mottled black patterns that indicated high stress, and her claws were partially extended signs that she was spiraling back into defensive anxiety despite the progress they'd made. Second thoughts? Louise asked, settling beside her with the gentle approach he'd learned to use during her difficult moments. Third and fourth thoughts, Arya replied, her voice tight with nervous energy. Louise, what if we're making a huge mistake? What if showing them Victorian food just reinforces their belief that we're too alien, too different, too dangerous to integrate with civilized species? Louise had been wrestling with the same concerns since making his impulsive offer to bring lunch to the hearing. The plan had seemed inspired during their late-night cooking session, but in the harsh light of morning, he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were attempting. Arya, can I tell you about the worst professional mistake I ever made? She looked at him with interest, perhaps grateful for any distraction from her spiraling anxiety. 5 years ago, I was working at an upscale restaurant that prided itself on elevated fusion cuisine. The head chef was this pretentious guy who thought traditional ethnic cooking was primitive. That real culinary art meant taking simple, cultural dishes and making them sophisticated through French techniques and presentation. Lise began pulling ingredients from storage, not because they needed to start cooking yet, but because the familiar motions seemed to calm both of them. One night, this food critic came in, really important guy whose reviews could make or break restaurants. The chef decided to serve him a deconstructed taco that was basically expensive ingredients arranged to look like modern art, with no connection to actual Mexican flavors or cultural meaning. I'm guessing the critic wasn't impressed. Worse, he loved it. Wrote this glowing review about how the chef had elevated simple peasant food to haute cuisine sophistication, called traditional tacos unsophisticated, and praised the restaurant for showing how primitive ethnic cooking could be improved through proper culinary training. Arya's skin patterns were shifting from pure anxiety to interested attention. That must have made you furious. It did. But here's the mistake I made. Instead of quitting or finding a way to respectfully challenge the chef's approach, I got angry and confrontational. Started a kitchen fight about cultural appropriation and culinary colonialism that ended with me getting fired and blacklisted from every decent restaurant in the city. So you were right, but you handled it wrong. Exactly. I was so focused on being angry about the injustice that I forgot my real goal wasn't to punish the chef for his ignorance. It was to create opportunities for people to experience authentic cultural food prepared with pride and respect. Luis began organizing their cooking materials with the systematic precision that always helped him think clearly during stressful situations. The point is, Arya, I learned that changing people's minds about cultural differences isn't about proving them wrong. It's about giving them experiences that are so undeniably beautiful and meaningful that their prejudices become irrelevant. But what if today's audience just isn't ready for that kind of experience? What if they taste our food and decide it confirms everything they already believe about Victorian culture being too intense for civilized society. Before Louise could answer, Dr. Chun arrived in the kitchen with the expression she wore during crisis management situations. "Louise, we need to discuss the hearing preparation. I've been reviewing Aria's file with the Academy administrators, and I'm concerned that your cooking demonstration might not be appropriate for a formal disciplinary proceeding. Dr. Chun, what's the worst-case outcome if today's hearing goes badly?" Aria gets transferred to a specialized facility for adolescents with severe behavioral challenges. No more family placement attempts, no more mainstream educational integration, no more opportunities to develop the social skills she needs for independent adult life. Louise felt the weight of that reality settling over the kitchen. They weren't just risking embarrassment or cultural misunderstanding. They were betting Aria's entire future on the hope that sharing her heritage might change minds instead of confirming prejudices. And what's the best-case outcome if we follow standard procedures? Aria gets one more chance at the Integration Academy with additional behavioral monitoring, mandatory anger management therapy, and cultural assimilation counseling designed to help her adapt to mainstream social expectations. Louise looked at Aria, whose expression had gone flat and resigned at the mention of cultural assimilation counseling. So either way, the message is that being Victorian is a problem that needs to be managed or eliminated. "Louise, I understand your frustration with systemic biases, but we have to work within existing frameworks to help these children succeed in this society. They'll need to navigate as adults. What if the framework is wrong?" Dr. Chun paused in her preparation of official documentation, looking up with the slightly irritated expression that administrators wore when maintenance staff questioned policy decisions. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if the problem isn't that Aria needs to change to fit society? What if the problem is that society needs to expand its definition of acceptable cultural expression to include kids like her?" Before Dr. Chun could respond, their conversation was interrupted by commotion from the dining hall. Through the service window, Louise could see a group of Integration Academy students who had arrived early for the hearing, apparently to observe the proceedings that would determine Aria's future. Among them was Crix, the young Kratarian who had led yesterday's mocking performance, along with several other children whose families had complained about Aria's presence at the academy. "Look, there's the violent one," Crix announced loudly enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. "My parents said she's probably going to get sent away today, where she can't hurt civilized kids anymore." Louise felt Aria tense beside him, her skin patterns shifting rapidly from anxiety to the mottled black that indicated rising aggression. "They came here to watch me get expelled," Aria said, her voice tight with humiliation and anger, "like it's entertainment." "Aria," Lou said quietly, "look at me, not at them." But the damage was escalating. More children were gathering in the dining hall, drawn by the spectacle of the orphanage's most notorious resident facing judgment. Some seemed genuinely curious about the outcome, but others were clearly enjoying the drama of watching someone else's downfall. "I heard she attacked 3 kids at once," one young voice announced. "My teacher said Victorians can't control their violent impulses," added another. "That's why they're not allowed in regular families," concluded a third. Louise watched Aria's claws extend as 18 months of accumulated frustration and public humiliation pushed her toward the explosive response that would confirm every prejudice and destroy any chance of a positive outcome at today's hearing. But then something unexpected happened. Tommy, the young human boy who had whispered warnings about Aria's moods, stepped forward from the crowd of observing children. "You guys are idiots," Tommy announced with the fearless clarity that only 8-year-olds could manage. "Aria's not violent. She's just tired of people being mean to her." The dining hall fell silent. "Tommy, you don't understand," Crix replied, with the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts. "Victorians are naturally aggressive. It's their species' nature." "That's stupid," Tommy shot back. "Louise has been teaching Aria how to cook Victorian food, and it smells amazing. If she was really violent, would Louise let her handle knives and hot stoves?" Louise felt a surge of unexpected emotion as he realized that Tommy, the shy kid, who rarely spoke up about anything, was publicly defending Aria based on observations he'd made during their kitchen lessons. "Besides," Tommy continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. Yesterday, when I spilled juice all over my homework, Arya helped me rewrite it during study time. She didn't have to do that. Mean people don't help with homework. This revelation seemed to surprise several of the observing children who hadn't known about Arya's quiet acts of kindness that happened away from adult supervision. And last week, added Marina, a young Andromedan girl, when I was crying because I missed my birth family, Arya sat with me during rec time and told me stories about her home world. She made me feel less lonely. Louise looked at Arya, whose aggressive posture was softening as she heard these testimonials about behaviors that the adults had never observed or documented. See? Tommy concluded with 8-year-old logic. The problem isn't that Arya's mean. The problem is that some people treat her mean, so she acts mean back. That's not the same thing. The dining hall erupted in murmured conversations as children began discussing their own observations and experiences with Arya interactions that had never been reported to the adults who were making decisions about her future. Dr. Chon was staring at the scene with the expression of someone whose professional assumptions were being challenged by evidence she'd never considered. Louise, she said quietly, how long have you known about these positive interactions? I suspected them, but I never had confirmation. Arya doesn't advertise her kindnesses. They happen when adults aren't watching and won't give her credit. Anyway, why didn't she mention these behaviors during therapy sessions or behavioral assessments? Louise looked at Arya, who was listening to the children's testimonials with an expression of amazement and tentative hope. Dr. Chun, would you talk about your good deeds to people who were convinced you were fundamentally dangerous? Or would you figure there was no point, since they'd already made up their minds about who you were? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Integration Academy administrators, who had come to escort Arya to the formal hearing. Louise could see the panel of officials who would determine her future. Stern-faced educators, concerned Kratarian parents, and bureaucrats, whose job was to make decisions based on documented behavioral patterns rather than individual circumstances. Time to go, Dr. Chon announced. Louise looked at Arya, who was staring at the assembled authority figures with the expression of someone facing execution. Arya, do you still want to bring lunch to this hearing? She was quiet for a long moment, processing everything that had just happened, the public humiliation, the unexpected support from younger children, and the realization that her reputation was more complex than she'd understood. Lise, what if Tommy's right? What if I'm not actually the problem? Then today's our chance to prove it. Arya straightened her shoulders, her skin patterns shifting from anxious black to the determined purple that Louise had learned indicated Victorian resolve. Let's cook. As they began preparing their cultural demonstration for an audience that had already decided Arya was too dangerous for mainstream integration, Lise realized that they weren't just fighting for one teenager's future. They were challenging a system that saw cultural differences as pathological, that punished kids for failing to assimilate into behavioral norms that didn't account for their heritage, and that made decisions about children's lives without actually understanding who those children were when they weren't being defensive. The hearing would determine whether Arya got transferred to a detention facility or received another chance at integration. But more importantly, it would reveal whether the galactic community was ready to expand its definition of acceptable childhood behavior to include kids whose cultural backgrounds didn't fit the approved template of civilized development. Lise began gathering ingredients with the focused determination of someone who understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought with wooden spoons and good intentions. The Integration Academy hearing room felt like a courtroom designed by committee, sterile, intimidating, and completely unsuited for what Louise was about to attempt. A panel of 5 administrators sat behind an imposing desk, flanked by the concerned Kratarian parents whose children had been injured in the cafeteria incident. Arya sat in the defendant's chair, her purple skin showing stress patterns that made her look exactly like the dangerous alien teenager everyone expected her to be. Before we begin the formal proceedings, Louise announced, wheeling a serving cart into the room, I'd like to serve lunch. The panel looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. Dr. Morthik, the Kratarian Academy administrator, consulted his agenda with visible annoyance. Mr. Garcia, This is a disciplinary hearing, not a social function. Please, remove the food service equipment and take your seat in the observer section. With respect, Dr. Morthick, I think you'll find this relevant to understanding Arya's behavioral patterns and cultural background. Luis began setting up portable, warming plates and serving dishes with the confidence of someone who had decided that conviction mattered more than protocol. The documented incidents of aggression all occurred in social contexts involving food, cultural identity, or peer interactions. I'd like to demonstrate what happens when those same elements are combined in a supportive rather than hostile environment. Principal Velara, a Zephyrian educator whose translucent features conveyed administrative impatience, gestured toward the door. Mr. Garcia, while we appreciate your concern for Arya's welfare, this hearing is based on documented behavioral incidents that require professional assessment, not culinary demonstrations. Actually, Luis said, continuing his setup despite the official objections, I think you'll find that this culinary demonstration addresses exactly the issues you're here to evaluate. He looked directly at Arya, whose expression had shifted from resignation to cautious hope as she watched him defend their unconventional approach. Arya, would you like to tell the panel about Victorian cultural values as they relate to food preparation and sharing? For a moment, Louise thought she might retreat into the defensive silence that had characterized her previous interactions with authority figures. But then Arya stood up, her posture straightening as she prepared to share knowledge that no one had ever asked her to demonstrate. In Victorian culture, she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, preparing food for others is considered one of the highest expressions of respect and care. The complexity of flavors represents the cook's investment in the recipient's well-being. She moved to assist Luis with the serving preparation, her movements becoming graceful and confident as she handled the familiar ingredients. Traditional Victorian meals are designed to create emotional as well as nutritional satisfaction. The heat levels, spice combinations, and preparation methods are all intended to demonstrate that the cook values the person being fed enough to invest significant time and skill in their nourishment. Dr. Morthick was consulting his cultural database with the expression of someone whose preconceptions were being challenged by unexpected information. Ms. Arya, our records indicate that Victorian dietary preferences are linked to aggressive behavioral tendencies. How do you respond to scientific documentation that suggests your species' food choices reflect inherent violence? Arya's skin patterns flickered between anxiety and anger, but instead of responding with the defensive hostility that everyone expected, she began plating the traditional meal she and Lise had prepared. Dr. Morthick, respectfully, those studies were conducted on adult Victorian soldiers during wartime, not on civilian families or children. It would be like studying human behavior by observing only military personnel during combat situations. Lise felt a surge of pride as he watched Arya apply critical thinking skills that none of the adults had credited her with possessing. Furthermore, Arya continued, arranging the complex dish with artistic precision. The intensity of traditional Victorian cuisine reflects our cultural value of emotional honesty. We believe that food should engage all the senses and create memorable experiences that strengthen social bonds. She presented the first serving to Dr. Morthick, whose reluctance was evident, but whose professional curiosity seemed to be overriding his administrative caution. This dish is called Velinari Kes, which translates roughly to welcome home. My birth mother taught me to prepare it as a way of showing love and respect to people who matter to you. Luis watched the panel's expressions as they tentatively tasted Arya's cultural offering. The initial wariness gave way to surprise, then genuine appreciation as the complex flavors revealed themselves in layers of heat, sweetness, and aromatic depth. This is quite sophisticated, admitted Principal Velara, whose translucent features were shifting to colors that indicated pleasant surprise in Zephyrian physiology. The flavor development shows remarkable technical skill, added Dr. Helix Chun, the human nutritionist on the panel. The balance of spice compounds demonstrates an understanding of culinary chemistry that's typically found only in professional cooking programs. But it was the response of Velik Stoneweaver, one of the concerned Kratarian parents, that surprised everyone most. Young Arya, he said, his rocky features softening as he savored another bite. This reminds me of meals I shared during my youth, when different species worked together on the asteroid mining projects. There was a Victorian engineer who cooked for our mixed crew, and her food created bonds between species that had never collaborated before. That was probably traditional preparation, Arya replied, her confidence growing as she saw positive responses to her cultural sharing. Victorian cuisine is designed to be inclusive, intense enough to satisfy our palates, but balanced in ways that most species can appreciate if they approach it with openness rather than prejudice. The room fell quiet as the implications of that statement settled over the assembled authority figures. Luis realized that something profound was happening. Instead of defending Arya's past behavior or promising future compliance with behavioral expectations, they were demonstrating her actual capabilities and cultural values in real time. Panel members, Luis said, I'd like to point out that the young person you're observing right now, articulate, thoughtful, skilled, culturally knowledgeable, and genuinely caring about others' experiences, is the same Arya who has been labeled as behaviorally problematic and unsuitable for mainstream integration. He gestured to Arya, whose purple skin was now showing the silver patterns that indicated confidence and engagement, rather than the mottled black of defensive aggression. The difference isn't that she's changed her fundamental nature. The difference is that she's being treated with respect instead of suspicion, asked to share her strengths instead of justify her existence, and given the opportunity to contribute rather than just comply. Dr. Morthick set down his serving utensil and consulted his documentation with visible uncertainty. Mr. Garcia, while this cultural demonstration is illuminating, it doesn't address the documented incidents of physical aggression against other students. You're right, Luis agreed. It doesn't address those incidents. It provides context for understanding them. He looked around the room at the panel members who were still processing their experience of Victorian cuisine and its creator. Every incident of aggression occurred when Arya's cultural identity was being mocked, dismissed, or treated as evidence of inherent pathology. She wasn't attacking people randomly. She was defending herself against systematic devaluation of everything that makes her who she is. But physical violence is never acceptable, Principal Valara pointed out. Agreed, but punishment without understanding doesn't solve the problem. It just teaches kids to hide their pain better. If we want different behavior, we need to create different conditions. Luis turned to address the Kratarian parents directly. Mr. and Mrs. Stoneweaver, your children were injured, and that's serious. But they were injured during an incident that began with them telling Arya that her species was inherently violent and unsuitable for civilized society. That's not casual teasing. That's systematic cultural assault. Valig Stoneweaver exchanged glances with his partner before responding. Mr. Garcia, we were not aware that the incident began with cultural harassment. Our children described it as unprovoked aggression during lunch break because they don't understand that mocking someone's heritage is provocation. They've learned that Victorian cultural traits are acceptable targets for ridicule. Arya stepped forward, her posture calm and confident rather than defensive. Mr. and Mrs. Stoneweaver, I want to apologize for injuring your children. My response was disproportionate and inappropriate. But I also want you to understand that hearing your kids say that people like me are too dangerous to exist, that felt like a threat to my right to belong anywhere. The Kratarian parents were quiet for several moments, processing this direct and articulate explanation from the teenager. They'd been told was dangerous and incapable of taking responsibility for her actions. Arya, Mrs. Stoneweaver said eventually, we had no idea that our children were engaging in cultural harassment. We thought they were simply observing factual differences between species. Cultural harassment often looks like factual observation. To people who haven't experienced it themselves, Arya replied with a maturity that surprised everyone in the room. But the impact on the targeted person is the same, regardless of the intent. Principal Villara was reviewing her notes with growing uncertainty about the predetermined outcome of the hearing. Arya, if you were allowed to continue at the Integration Academy, how would you handle future incidents of cultural harassment without resorting to physical responses? For the first time since the hearing began, Arya smiled. I'd invite them to lunch. A room erupted in surprised laughter, breaking the formal tension that had characterized the proceedings. "I'm serious," Arya continued. "Most prejudice comes from ignorance and fear of the unknown. People who understand Victorian culture, who have experienced our hospitality and generosity, don't see us as inherently violent. They see us as protective of what we value." Luis watched the panel members exchange glances that suggested their preconceived conclusions about the hearing's outcome were being reconsidered in real time. "Panel members," he said, "I'd like to propose an alternative to the standard disciplinary responses being considered." "We're listening," Dr. Morthick replied. "Instead of punishing Arya for failing to assimilate into a system that devalues her cultural identity, what if we created opportunities for her to share that identity in ways that build bridges instead of barriers?" Luis outlined his vision for a cultural exchange program where older orphans like Arya could teach younger children about their heritage through cooking, storytelling, and traditional arts. Transform the thing that's been seen as a problem into a solution. Use Arya's knowledge and skills to help other kids understand that cultural differences are resources to be celebrated rather than obstacles to be overcome. As the panel deliberated, Luce realized that they had accomplished something unprecedented. They had shifted the conversation from whether Arya could be fixed to whether the system could be improved. Whether that would be enough to change her future remained to be seen. 3 months after the Integration Academy hearing that almost ended with Arya's transfer to a detention facility, Luis Garcia found himself standing before the Galactic Council for Juvenile Integration, explaining how a simple cooking lesson had led to the most successful cultural rehabilitation program in the known galaxy. The breakthrough insight, Luis told the assembled delegates, wasn't that we needed to change Arya to fit the system. It was that we needed to expand the system to value what kids like Arya could contribute. The council chamber was filled with administrators, educators, and policymakers from 47 different species, all seeking to understand how the Harmony Heights model had achieved unprecedented success in integrating previously unadoptable alien youth into mainstream society. In 6 months, we've placed 12 children who were classified as behaviorally problematic into permanent family situations, not through behavioral modification or cultural assimilation, but through programs that help them share their cultural strengths with their new communities. Luis clicked to his next presentation slide, showing Arya in her new role as Cultural Integration Coordinator for the Academy's expanded diversity program. Arya now teaches traditional vegetarian cooking to mixed species classes 3 times a week. The kids who used to bully her are now her most enthusiastic students, and her adoptive family, the Stoneweavers, credits her cultural knowledge with enriching their understanding of galactic diversity. The irony wasn't lost on Luis that Arya had been adopted by the same Crotarian family whose children she'd injured during the cafeteria incident. But what had begun as a disciplinary crisis had evolved into a friendship based on mutual respect and cultural curiosity. The key insight, Luce continued, is that most behavioral problems in orphaned alien youth aren't evidence of pathology. They're evidence of cultural strengths being expressed in environments that don't understand or value those strengths. Dr. Prison Chun, now director of the expanded Harmony Heights program, joined Lise at the podium to share outcome statistics. That had surprised even the program's advocates. Recidivism rates among participants in culturally affirming placement programs are 73%, lower than traditional assimilation-based approaches. Family satisfaction ratings are 89% higher. And most significantly, the children report feeling valued for who I am, rather than accepted despite who I am. Luis watched the audience of galactic administrators process these results with expressions of professional skepticism mixed with genuine curiosity. Delegate Vel Tar from the Regelian Education Ministry raised a tentacle. Mr. Garcia, while these outcomes are impressive, how do you address concerns about cultural relativism? Some traditional practices may be incompatible with modern galactic society. Delegate Vel Tar, we're not advocating for uncritical acceptance of all cultural practices. We're advocating for understanding the values behind cultural expressions and finding ways to honor those values within contemporary frameworks. Luis shared the example of Zix, a young Andromedan whose species' traditional meditation practices had been classified as dissociative episodes by previous therapists. Instead of treating his meditation as pathology, we created quiet spaces where he could practice traditional centering techniques. His academic performance improved by 340%. His stress levels decreased significantly, and he was adopted by a family who appreciated having someone who could teach them about Andromedan spiritual practices. The presentation continued with case studies demonstrating how cultural knowledge had become social currency, rather than social liability for the program participants. Tommy, the 8-year-old human boy who first defended Arya, is now fluent in basic Victorian cooking techniques. He's teaching them to his new foster siblings and has become a bridge between species in his integrated classroom. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Crix. The young Kratarian who had led the bullying campaign against Arya had requested permission to address the council about his experience in the cultural integration program. Honorable delegates, Crix began, his rocky features showing the confident bearing that Kratarians developed when speaking about matters of importance. I want to apologize for my previous behavior toward Arya and explain what I learned from participating in Victorian cultural education. Luis watched the council's attention focus completely on this articulate young alien who had transformed from prejudiced bully to cultural advocate. I learned that when I was making fun of Victorian food and calling it aggressive, I was really just afraid of things I didn't understand. But when Arya taught me how to prepare velinary kes and explained the cultural values behind the complex flavors, I realized that intensity isn't the same as aggression. Crix paused, his expression growing more serious. Victorian culture values emotional honesty and sensory engagement. Their food is intense because they believe that meaningful experiences should involve all of your senses and create lasting memories. That's not primitive, that's sophisticated. The young Kratarian's testimony continued with observations about friendship, cultural bridge building, and the difference between assimilation and integration. Arya didn't become less Victorian to fit in with Kratarian society. She became more confidently Victorian, which made her a better friend and a more interesting person to know. And I became a better Kratarian by learning to appreciate perspectives that were different from my own cultural background. Luis felt tears in his eyes as he listened to this transformation. From a kid who had once advocated for Arya's removal from civilized society. After the formal presentation, Luis found himself surrounded by delegates, asking detailed questions about implementation strategies, funding requirements, and adaptability to different galactic regions. But the conversation that mattered most came from Arya herself, who had traveled to the council chambers to observe the presentation about the program that had changed her life. Lise, she said, as they walked through the council complex's gardens, I have something I want to tell you. I'm listening. When I first came to the orphanage, I thought the problem was that I was fundamentally broken. Too angry, too alien, too different to belong anywhere. I spent 3 years trying to make myself smaller, quieter, more acceptable. They paused beside a fountain that combined water elements from 12 different worlds, creating a harmony of sounds and visual effects that no single species could have achieved alone. But what you taught me through cooking, through treating my culture as something valuable rather than something problematic, is that the goal isn't to fit in. The goal is to contribute, to find ways to share what makes you special instead of hiding what makes you different. Arya's skin showed the silver patterns of contentment mixed with the purple of cultural pride. I'm not grateful that you helped me become more acceptable to galactic society. I'm grateful that you helped galactic society become more accepting of people like me. 6 months later, Luis received a message that made him realize the full scope of what their simple cooking lessons had accomplished. The Galactic Council had approved funding for cultural integration programs on 847 worlds, serving over 12,000 orphaned alien youth who had previously been classified as difficult to place. The Harmony Heights model was being adapted for everything from refugee resettlement to corporate diversity training, but the message that brought tears to his eyes came from Velek Stoneweaver, Arya's adoptive father. Luis, I wanted you to know that Arya has been accepted to the Galactic Culinary Institute, where she'll be studying interspecies cuisine and cultural food traditions. But more importantly, she's teaching her younger siblings, our biological children, that differences aren't obstacles to overcome. They're opportunities to learn something beautiful about the universe. Louis smiled as he finished reading the message in his kitchen at Harmony Heights, surrounded by the sounds of 43 children from 12 different species. Enjoying lunch together. Sometimes changing the galaxy started with something as simple as asking someone what they'd like to eat, then caring enough to learn how to make it properly. Sometimes the most profound transformations began with treating people like they had something valuable to share instead of something dangerous to contain. And sometimes the best way to help someone find their place in the world was to help the world make room for who they already were.